One of the classic aircraft of World War I was the Avro 504, possibly the most manufactured military aircraft of that conflict. It saw first flight on 18th of September 1913 and was only retired from service in 1934. It saw service in pretty much every role possible for an aircraft of that era, including reconnaissance, light bombing, as a fighter, and most famously as a trainer. Following the war, it saw significant use in civilian hands, with over 300 on the British Civil Register alone. Those saw extensive use in flying schools, in barnstorming exhibitions, as well as pleasure flights. As this presentation would be rather long, to put it mildly, I'm going to do it in 3 parts. The first is the introduction, covering the early exploratory versions up to the Avro 504H. The second will cover the remaining versions, including the definitive 504K. The final part will cover the combat history that I will mention briefly here, but will be more fully fleshed out later. The genesis of the Avro 504 starts with one Edwin Elliot Verdon Roe, better known as A.V. Roe. Born on the 26th of April 1877 to Edwin Roe, a doctor, and Annie Verdon in Patricroft, Eccles, Lancashire, he left England aged 14 to go to Canada, where he had been offered training as a surveyor. This endeavour came to naught due to a slump in the silver market and an associated lack of demand for surveyors, so he returned home a year later. After serving as an apprentice with the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, he attempted to join the Royal Navy, but though he passed the technical and mathematics paper, he was refused for failing some of the general subjects. Instead, he joined the Merchant Marine as 5th engineer on the SS Jebba, finishing as 3rd engineer on the SS Ichanga. Apparently, it was during his voyages that he became interested in the possibility of building a flying machine, having observed the soaring flights of albatrosses. In 1906, he applied for the job of Secretary of the Royal Aero Club, and was accepted due to his enthusiasm for aviation, despite there being other, better qualified applicants. The job didn't last long, as he was then offered a job as a draftsman by G.L.O. Davidson, who was building a twin-rotored aircraft in Denver, Colorado in the USA, and it was to there that Roe travelled. However, problems with the design, to put it mildly, and his salary led to his resignation. At this point he was back in England, having been sent there to deal with patent issues, so at the very least someone had paid for his travel. His efforts at building aircraft commenced in 1907. He began with models, winning a Daily Mail prize of £75 for one of his designs that was rather reminiscent of a Wright type. His first aircraft capable of carrying a man, known as the One Biplane, was submitted to the 1908 Brooklands competition for the first aircraft capable of flying around the track. However, despite much taxiing, it proved capable of taking to the air only when given a tow by helpful motorists. With only a 9-horsepower engine, it was woefully underpowered. The aircraft was quite advanced in some ways, employing a single-stick control method to warp and pivot the front elevator. Some consider him to be the true inventor of the joystick, though this is contested by others who claim that Robert Esnault-Pelterie was the first inventor of the joystick. Regardless, they both made substantial fortunes following World War I for use of their patents. Roe's first truly successful aircraft, often said to be the first all-British aircraft, was the One Triplane, which, despite using the same underpowered engine as the One Biplane, was built sufficiently lightly that it was capable of taking off, if only just. Its first hops into the air occurred on June 5, 1909, and with experimentation and experience, basically Roe was learning to fly, he managed a flight of 100 feet on July 13, 1909, and followed that up with a flight of 900 feet 10 days later. The height was only about 10 feet, and probably benefited from ground effect, but it still counts. Further experiments followed, and a second version of the triplane, which resulted in an aircraft capable of flying a circular course under control. It was assisted by the installation of a somewhat more powerful engine. On January 1st, 1910, Roe founded the Avro Aircraft Company, along with his brother Humphrey, who had been a source of financing. In 1913, this was renamed Avro and Company, better known as Avro. Avro is perhaps best known for the Avro Lancaster of World War II and the Avro Vulcan of the Cold War period. It was amalgamated into Hawker Siddeley Aviation in July 1963 and persisted only as a marketing brand until 2001. However, it is not my intent to give a blow-by-blow account of Avro, nor of Avro's career, nor yet of every single pre-World War I aircraft produced by the Avro Company. Suffice it to say, between 1910 and 1913, 11 more distinct aircraft types were produced. It is interesting to see the changes that were made during those 3 years, as triplanes gave way to biplanes, and the distinctive shape of the Avro 504 begins to emerge. The family lineage is quite clear. During this time, 2 aircraft in particular stand out. The first of these is the Avro Type D in its seaplane configuration. This was the first seaplane to take off from British seawater. Given Avro's later association with the Sanders Roe Company, probably best known for building flying boats, it's definitely worth mentioning. The second aircraft that stands out is the Avro Type F, a cabin monoplane that was the first aircraft to have a fully enclosed cockpit. Despite the number of types produced and the obvious improvements that were ongoing, it cannot in all honesty be said that Avro was particularly successful commercially. Most were produced in 1s or 2s, although some did see use as flying trainers. Their most successful aircraft was the Avro Type E, of which 18 were manufactured, primarily for use as trainers by the Royal Flying Corps as 2-seaters, with 5 single-seat versions being used to equip No. 3 Squadron at Netheravon in January of 1913. This aircraft, also known as the Avro 500, is where the success of the company really starts. The first flight of the Avro 500 was in March of 1912. With several months of other types interspersed, design work on its successor began in November of the same year, and was completed in early 1913, in fact while the 500 was still being delivered. The new aircraft, dubbed the Avro 504, was a very lightly built machine. The fuselage had a rectangular section, wire-braced box girder, using ash longhorns that were channeled to save weight. This channeling would have added some rigidity, though not as much as if they had been full diameter. For maximum view, the pilot sat in the rear, with the passenger occupying the front cockpit. It was, needless to say, a 2-seater. The wings were supported by a 4-strut carbane surrounding the front cockpit. The wings themselves were equal in span and chord, but staggered by 2 feet, with the upper in advance of the lower. The undercarriage was 2 wheels under the forward cockpit, with a skid between them in a manner that made the aircraft quite recognizable. A tail dragger, the tail skid was attached to a comma-shaped rudder. Although of a construction and appearance that would rapidly become conventional, it was regarded as being of an advanced design in 1913. A new 80-horsepower Gnome rotary provided the power, driving a 2-bladed propeller. This combination would drive the prototype to a top speed of 81 miles per hour, which was respectable for the time. To the general public, it would have appeared that the aircraft popped into existence rather suddenly, as it was seen for the first time at the 1913 Aerial Derby on the 20th of September, the morning of the race. Unbeknown to most, it was a virtually untried aircraft, having flown for the first time on the 18th. Regardless, it attracted attention due to its racy lines, appearance of speed, and because it performed respectably well against the competition, achieving 4th place out of 9 competitors at an average speed of 66.5 miles per hour over a 94-mile circuit. It proved to be a sound design, though in need of a few tweaks that included an improved engine mounting having a more streamlined cowling, lightened aileron controls, and strengthened wings. These changes were designed and implemented by the end of November, and the resulting aircraft saw a considerable amount of testing in races and exhibitions from late 1913 through early 1914 to good results. It was raced, tested, raced some more, purchased by the Daily Mail newspaper and toured the country giving passenger flights, fitted with floats and flown some more, and all this in the first 7 months of its existence. With the outbreak of war on August the 4th, it was commandeered by the Royal Naval Air Service, but the engine failed during its delivery flight 2 days later, and the seaplane had to put down on land, in which process it damaged it beyond repair. And this was just the prototype. Series production had commenced, as far as I can tell, even before the Avro 504's first flight, with the War Office ordering 12 aircraft in the summer of 1913. This necessitated some changes to meet military requirements, basically restressing and strengthening the wings. These 12 had all been delivered before the onset of World War I, and when No. 5 Squadron left for France on August the 13th, a few Avro 504s were among them. One of these became the first British aircraft brought down by infantry fire over Belgium. Another was fitted with a Lewis gun, and that aircraft became, if not the first, then one of the earliest to strafe a ground target in October. That same aircraft forced down an Albatros 2-seater a month later. Only a few of the basic 504s saw frontline service, and at its peak 13 were operating in RFC squadrons over the Western Front. However, this was not the limit of the aircraft's active service, and 7 were ordered in the spring of 1914 by the Admiralty. The Royal Naval Air Service equipped them with 4 16 or 20-pound bombs, and used them quite successfully in strikes against the Germans. Perhaps the most famous of these raids was a well-planned attack on the Zeppelin sheds at Friedrichshafen, in which the 4-plus-hour duration of the 504 proved extremely useful, the raid necessitating a 250-mile round trip, which, while paltry by the standards of, say, World War II, was quite impressive for so early in World War I. By the end of March 1915, the Avro 504 had been withdrawn from frontline service and relegated primarily to training duty, a role it performed with distinction for over 15 years. Some were converted with dual controls, and some built from scratch for that purpose. By the end of Avro 504 production, 68 had been built. However, this was just the beginning. What I've been talking about so far is the basic 504. I have yet to touch on the variants, and as the war progressed, modifications led to several of these. The Avro 504A, built for the Royal Flying Corps, was a strengthened version of the 504, with wide-chord interplane struts and ailerons of reduced span. The lower wing roots were sometimes stripped of their fabric covering to improve the downward view. Royal Naval Air Surface requirements led to the 504B, with wing spars of greater cross-section and a return to the longer ailerons of the original 504. A cutout was applied to the rear cockpit to make it easier for the pilot to get in and out, and possibly to improve vision to the sides. A few of the RNAS 504Bs saw operational service flying out of Dunkirk. 2 of these were equipped with forward-firing guns and interrupter gear, which this early in the war must have been the Vickers Challenger system, which, though available from December 1915, proved unreliable with rotary engine aircraft. In the early hours of May 17, 1915, 2 504Bs made pioneering interceptions of Zeppelin airships, equipped with hand grenades and bombs. One was unable to climb quickly enough to make an attack, but the other pilot was able to drop his ordnance and cause slight fire damage that later led to the airship making a heavy landing in Belgium. Most of the Avro 504Bs were used as naval trainers, and later production models were equipped with an 80 horsepower Lerone and provision for a scarf ring used to mount a Lewis gun. At least one was used in early Decker-Rester gear experiments. Endurance, although impressive at 4.5 hours, was found to be insufficient for coastal reconnaissance, and a single-seater version was produced that had an endurance of 8 hours. Dubbed the 504C, the front cockpit was replaced by a larger fuel tank. It also featured a cutout in the upper wing to allow the pilot to fire a Lewis gun upwards at an angle of 45 degrees. 80 were manufactured. The RFC equivalent was dubbed the Avro 504D, but as far as can be determined, only 5 were built. Possibly. Modifications up to this point led to a slight but inevitable drop-off in performance, and the installation of a 100 horsepower Gnome monosoupape led to the 504E. The rear cockpit was moved backwards, and a fuel tank installed between the occupants, which must have filled them with delight. The change in the centre of gravity led to the reducing of the wing stagger from 2 feet to just 9 inches. 9 were built, according to production serial numbers. At the suggestion of the Admiralty, a single Avro 504C was equipped with a 75 horsepower Rolls-Royce Hawk 6-cylinder inline engine. Designated the 504F, it proved an unsuccessful combination, and an order for 30 was cancelled and replaced by one for the 504C equipped with 80 horsepower Lerone rotaries. Apparently an RFC gunnery trainer was equipped with a 130 horsepower Clerget and equipped with a synchronized front Vickers and a rear Lewis. 9 were manufactured, possibly as conversions of an earlier type. Dubbed the 504G, it clashed with the Royal Naval Air Service, who used the same designation for a development of Avro 504Bs that featured the same armament. The last of what has been described as the early exploratory versions was the 504H, a single aircraft that was a strengthened 504C fitted with catapult pickup points and a specially padded seat. This became one of the first aircraft to be launched by catapult. Production numbers of the original 504 were 68, or so, including the prototype. At least 4, hence my or so, before the war were exhibition, private and experimental aircraft, and the remainder were primarily for the RFC, with 7 acquired by the Royal Naval Air Service, including the 6 used on the Friedrichshafen raid. 504A production totaled over 1,600, although some of these, an unknown number, were completed as 504J or 504Ks. The Royal Naval Air Service acquired just over 300 504Bs, although a few, perhaps 20, were delivered as 504Js and 19 were transferred to the RFC. 104 504Cs were manufactured, along with 5 504Ds and 9 504Es. All other variants were conversions of pre-existing manufactured aircraft. Total production of these early aircraft was about 2,100 units, and demand was such that the Avro and Company's production facilities were unable to keep up and had to subcontract to several other manufacturers. Most of this production occurred between 1914 and 1916, and some inevitable overlap with later models. There is lots of room for manoeuvre in the smaller batch numbers. As far as I can tell, of the Avro 504 and its early variants, none survive. As this presentation is already dragging on considerably, I am going to bring this one to a close. As I said previously, 2 more will follow, covering the later production variants, especially the definitive Avro 504K, and an operational history of the aircraft that will fill in the gaps. If you've made it this far into the video, hopefully it means you enjoyed the content. If you would like to see more, please click the subscribe button, leave a like, and feel free to join in the conversation in the comments. Questions and suggestions are welcome.